Hello, I'm your host, Nick Jackson, and this is another episode of the Slow Loriss series. It would be hard to find anybody in the world who has done more for slow loriss research and conservation than Dr. Anna Nekaris. She is a professor in primate conservation at Oxford Brookes University and the director of the Little Fireface project. She is featured in the BBC documentary about lorisses called Jungle Gremlins of Java, and she has given a TED Talk about lorisses and their relationship with social media. She was also nice enough to meet me in New Orleans during this year's American Association of Physical Anthropologists meeting, where she had been invited to speak. Unfortunately, New Orleans is a terrible place to conduct an audio interview. We walked around the French Quarter for like a mile looking for a quiet place, and the best we could find was this little cafe that wasn't all that quiet. But without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Anna Nekaris.
My name is Anna Nekaris, and I'm a professor in primate conservation at Oxford Brookes University in the UK, and I've been studying lorisses for more than 20 years, and I run a project called the Little Fireface Project.
Thank you so much. And for the listener, I'm not sure how much they're going to be able to hear, but we are in a little cafe in the French Quarter in New Orleans. Can you explain a little bit the event that's going on?
I'm here at an American Association of Physical Anthropologists meeting. It's an annual event for people interested in primates, human evolution, human disease, and they meet to tell their latest findings.
Do you remember the first time you saw a loriss?
The first time I saw a loriss was in person, actually. I was an undergraduate and I was studying primatology, and I wanted to study animals that no one had ever studied before. So I got interested in lemurs. I went to a conference at Duke University called Creatures of the Dark, the Nocturnal Prosimians in 1994. And there's a big primate center there. It used to be called the Duke University Primate Center, and it was the center in the world for lemurs, lorisses, bush babies, and tarsiers. And they've subsequently focused on lemurs, and now they're called the Duke Lemur Center. But back then they had quite a few lorisses, and the first one I ever saw, I was allowed to feed it a raisin, which I now know is a really terrible thing to do.
It seems like they've moved entirely away from lorisses. Do you know why?
I suppose in the media, there's so much interest in lemurs and Madagascar and its unique fauna, and the other nocturnal primates get forgotten. They aren't considered as diverse, or maybe they're not as interesting to see in a zoo because they're all nocturnal. So lemurs have ones that are out in the day and they make a nice zoo exhibit. Whereas when you have lorisses or bush babies or tarsiers, the public have to strain to see them or they're asleep. So they just become more and more forgotten. And if you look at research as well, many people, hundreds of people are working on lemurs, and there's just a tiny handful working on lorisses and bush babies.
Okay, yeah, I guess the same thing has happened at San Diego Zoo. You know, they used to have the big program. They don't even have a single loris in their whole...
Oh, wow.
A single loris in the whole zoo, yeah.
Yeah, I think the zoos, they want to focus their efforts on breeding programs that are viable and sustainable. And one of the problems with loris is they never bred well in captivity. And the reason they didn't breed well is we now know there are so many species, and we know they have a really specialized diet. So they're feeding them terrible food, housing them in tiny cages. They're super territorial. So adult males, for example, were killing infants when they did have infants. So there were many, many problems with breeding. I think they started giving up on them.
How many species of slow loriss are there?
At the moment, there are 9 species of slow loriss, and there are likely to be more.
And you were responsible for, I'll put discovering, that's not the appropriate scientific word.
I would say I was responsible for gathering enough data to verify that what people knew 200 years ago when they first saw these animals in the wild and called them something different, that they are indeed different. So over the years, people lump in split species and they put them together and take them apart, but lorisses are definitely distinct.
Can you explain for somebody like me? So my little brother is tall and has blonde hair, and I mean, we're the same species, but if you looked at us, we look pretty different. So when you look at two lorisses that look different, what's the difference between a situation like that and, you know, a situation where they're actually different species?
For some animals, things like color and height are not important, like a lot of domestic breeds of animals. But for wild animals, especially nocturnal ones that don't rely on vision, if we see small, consistent differences in certain parts of their biology that might have some sort of function in evolution, we can have a strong suspicion that they are distinct species. But one of the other main things we look at is biogeographic barriers. So we look for rivers or mountain ranges that would have separated populations for up to millions of years, which meant they couldn't interbreed with their neighbors, which means there are a certain percentage of genetic difference distinct. And even if they could come together today in a zoo and interbreed, that does not mean they are different species, because many, many species in the world can produce hybrids, but it means that it would really not happen in the wild, or it might only happen in tiny little zones where they occasionally come together. With the lorises, we tend to see things like their skull is a different size and shape, and it's reflected in what they eat in the wild. Or we see one of the different species, it actually changes its coat color seasonally, which is very different.
I'm interested in what we do and do not know about the loriss. Since their waking life is at night, it seems like we don't know much, and because we haven't spent much money to do much research, we don't know much about them. Things about like their social behavior. I read in one study that the pygmy loriss has been known to, they use the word torpor.
Yeah, torpor, yeah.
Basically sleeping for 3 straight days,
Yeah.
which is, it seems very rare.
A mini overview on the behavior of lorisses. They were rarely studied in the wild, so there's been a few studies, one in 1980 by a guy who tried to study them and failed and managed to follow them for 3 days with a little radio collar. In the late 90s, another guy did a PhD in Malaysia. And then after that, I and my PhD students started doing studies around the world, so all around Asia. So in Cambodia, we radio tracked some pygmy lorises. In India, we followed Bengal slow lorises for 2 years without radio collars because we weren't allowed. And now in Java, we're in our 6th year of continuous follow of the same population. So it's the first time we know anything about a loriss, any loriss or galago, for a long-term study of the same individuals continuously. And so we can answer many more questions about what they do. There are some things that all lorisses seem to do, and there are many things we don't know because there's going to be differences between individual species. One of the most amazing things we found about lorisses is the fact they're one of the only primates that specializes in eating gums. So they have a thing in their mouth, their teeth form a tooth comb, and this is incisor and the fang, the canine teeth, and they could use it to gouge holes in trees.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit? Because I've heard it described as lorisses have 2 tongues.
Oh, that's different. So that's a separate thing. So the first important, actually all lemurs and lorises have a tooth comb and 2 tongues. And the function of the second tongue, which is really hard keratinous structure, like a nail, and it's underneath the main tongue, which in lorises is one of the longest tongues of all the primates. It was thought to clean between the front teeth, because the tooth comb are these very tiny needle-like teeth that are pressed closely together, and the under tongue was thought to work as a kind of dental floss. But we also found that they are able to collect pollen on that under tongue because it's a hard structure, and it helps them to pollinate flowers. But the tooth comb itself, it's used for grooming other animals. They actually rake their other animals' fur with their teeth. Like monkeys use their hands. Lorises and bush babies would never do that. They always just rake each other. They rake their own fur. And then they also use it for gouging holes in trees to eat saps and gums. And the slow lorises use it to inject venom.
What about their social behavior?
So the main thing we know about their social behavior for most of the slow lorises is they're monogamous. They live in unimale, unifemale pairs. So when we use the word monogamy as a description of social organization, we have to use it loosely because we call it their social family system. It's how they live their daily lives. Doesn't mean that when they mate, their mating system is very different. So many males can mate with a female in the very limited time she's an estrus. But in general, the incredible thing in our 5-year study is we have animals that were paired at the beginning of that 5 years that are still paired. And they're very, very affectionate. They have a very tight-knit social unit. They have a home range overlap. So we look at how they move through the forest, and we could put it into a computer program to make little shapes. And there's just a complete overlap between these pairs and their offspring that have highly defended territories against their neighbors. And they fight viciously at these territories to defend their boundaries. And they also use ultrasonic communication to defend those boundaries.
What about the hibernation stuff? I just read that on the plane, and I was like, wow, I haven't seen that anywhere, and it seemed incredibly rare for a primate.
I should almost leave that to Katie, because that's her whole PhD.
Oh, okay, great, yeah.
But I could tell you very quickly that it's been known for many, many years that lemurs from Madagascar can hibernate. And so it was thought that it was a unique thing about how lemurs got to Madagascar, how they could colonize Madagascar. But now we know, we had evidence that lorisses could do it. And then that work you're referring to was done in captivity, where they actually did surgery on the animals and implanted them with loggers that monitored their temperature. We've been doing something similar but less invasive. They wear little collars, and the temperature logger touches their neck, and we could see how their temperature fluctuates every day over the year. And we did it with adults and young ones, and we have very clear evidence for wild animals, not just captive ones, that they go into torpor. So torpor is where you just become very cold, reduce your metabolism, and you can save energy, especially during cold. And the hibernation happens when that torpor occurs over multiple days.
Understand. What about, this is probably the most widely known thing about lorisses, their venomous properties. Can you describe their venomous properties? We'll start there.
I would like to comment the fact you said it's the most widely known thing, because I started a project on slow loris venom in 2011, and before that it was virtually unknown, and it was so unknown that nobody believed it, and they laughed at me. And the single paper that was written about it, they laughed at that person, essentially. Well, people said, that's ridiculous, it's a venomous primate. And so, despite the fact he published his paper in 1995, there was evidence of a person dying from a loris bite in 1972. The fact that nobody ever researched it shows that in primatology what skepticism there was to a primate being venomous. We do know there's a few other venomous mammals. We have some shrews, the platypus, the solenodon. And so when I started my project, I used them as a basis, as a closely related animal, to try to understand why lorises were venomous. So what we've been doing is we had several hypotheses to investigate, or research questions to investigate, and we wondered if lorises, like shrews, used venom to get prey, to make their prey immobile. They become little zombies. We wanted to see if they were like some birds, where they use their venom to coat their fur to prevent ectoparasites like ticks and fleas. And we wanted to see if they were like platypus, where they use their venom to fight other lorises. And of course, in primatology, it was believed, well, if you're venomous, it must have something to do with predation. As it turns out, there's not a lot of evidence that lorises are predated upon, and there's not much evidence at all that they use their venom against predators. And when we do tests of loris venom with predators, predators don't care, and they eat anything. So it's not a real predator defense. When we looked at if they did anything with their prey, they just annihilate prey, they eat the head, they eat it whole, they don't cache or store prey, so there's no evidence they use it for that. We did find when we put their venom onto things like ticks and fleas, they all died. So there's clearly a potential for loris venom to use in ectoparasite control. But the most exciting thing about loris venom that nobody really thought would be the case is lorises are one of the only primates that when you pick them up, they immediately put their arms over their heads, and they lock their arms over their heads, and it's almost impossible to pull them off their head. And when they're doing this, they combine oil from a brachial gland, from a gland on their arm. It's not on their elbow, like you read. I don't know where that came from. And they mix it with their mouth, saliva in their mouth, and that makes a lethal cocktail, which has many, many interesting volatile and semi-volatile compounds, as we say, of proteins. There is one in that was identifiable, that's cat allergen. So then people go, it's not venom, it's an allergen. But that's the identifiable protein. There's plenty of other things in there that we're still working on, trying to understand what they are. And the impact of these bites is during territorial battles between these highly social pairs that have very solid, well-fought, they're solid pairs in these well-fought territories. They will, both males and females, fight at the boundaries of their range, using venom as a weapon. And when animals are young and they disperse from home for the first time, they'll have horrendous fights with this venom as they seek to establish a new territory. So we see horrendous wounds, we see necrosis and flesh rotting on these animals that are finding new territories or fighting at the boundaries. And also in illegal wildlife trade, when traders catch slow lorises, they tend to pack them in crates, and those animals often come out with the most disgusting terrible, non-healing wounds that caused the death of many of the animals in the shipment.
Another stupid, not because I'm not a science person, question. Are all venomous animals susceptible to their own venom? A rattlesnake,
No.
for example, if they're bitten by another rattlesnake, would that be venomous?
That is an excellent question, because venom for interspecific competition has only evolved 3 or 4 times in the entire animal kingdom of all animals that use venom. It's in cone snails, it's in ghost shrimp, platypus, and then slow lorises. And that's it. So snakes don't do it. Scorpions don't use it. It's not in the same way as interspecific competition.
Okay, so that's further evidence that if their venom works on a fellow slow loris, they must have evolved to use their venom on a slow loris.
Yes.
Okay, I understand.
And also, no other primates do that. When we do have a lot of problems with slow lorises in illegal trade, and one of the biggest problems that's been occurring ever since rescue centers have been taking them in is the death that results from these venomous bites, because it just seems that antibiotics, antifungal agents, nothing works to cure these wounds except what they're eating in the wild, or the conditions of being in the wild. But an animal with a bite wound in a cage is a dead animal, basically.
Have you ever been bitten by a loris?
Many times. So yeah, I've been bitten many times, and I've had effects some of those times. I've had wounds that wouldn't heal for weeks. I've once nearly had an anaphylactic shock, but I was really lucky because I was bitten through a glove. But my heart rate was really high. And the funniest thing about that day is we were catching a loris to put radio color on, and my data are horrendous. I wrote the craziest numbers you've ever seen in your life.
But nothing like you needed to get rushed to the hospital.
I never had to, but my colleagues have. So I wrote a paper recently with my colleague who was bitten and nearly died.
Is that the one? I read one that I think he was bitten on his hand, and then his hand blew up. It looked almost like a cartoon, like a balloon hand.
That was a lady, it's in the same paper, and that
Okay.
was a lady who had a loris as a pet, and her pet loris bit her, and she got a balloon hand out of it. And we used that as a secondary medical case study in the same paper. He actually caught a wild baby loris in Malaysia, and he wanted to take a photograph of it, and it bit him. And he was in the middle of a very remote forest, so he was very lucky that there was a very good clinic there that knew how to handle anaphylactic shock. And we've actually recently done a questionnaire with people who handle lorises, and we've had 90 responses. And we've had some incredible stories of people who were hospitalized, nearly died, had blood in their urine, which is another symptom of being bitten by a loris, and people who cannot even be in a room where lorises have been because they immediately suffer from a reaction.
Let's talk about some of their threats. I know the pet trade is a big factor. I want to get into that. But in one of these pieces I read the phrase catastrophic forest decline. And I've lived in an urban place my whole life, so there was never nature to have been destroyed. And I assume when a lot of people read a phrase like catastrophic forest decline, they have a lot of difficulty contextualizing what that means. And I know you spent a lot of time in Indonesia, so I was hoping you might be able to maybe describe, from what you've seen, what catastrophic forest decline looks like.
I think my most gripping image of catastrophic forest decline was sitting on a plane flying into Sabah in Malaysia and hearing the tourists next to me say how green and beautiful it was, but I knew it was all oil palm plantations, and the forest had been completely converted to oil palm, which is a monoculture that when you have a single species of one plant going for thousands of hectares, hectare is the size of like a soccer field. So the amount of wildlife that plantation can sustain is very minimal. And all of the animals that would have lived there would have been contributing to incredible amounts of biodiversity, oxygen into the atmosphere. We call the rainforest the lungs of the earth. They're producing all the water we need. They are the lungs of the earth. Without the rainforest, there is no earth. And so to see in an island like Borneo, that in the 50s was almost completely forested, and now the forest has declined so incredibly just for human use, mainly oil palm and rice. start to feel hopeless. But all we can do, and every individual can do, is realize that their choices they make as consumers, all the things they think they need but they actually don't need, that are coming from this destruction of the rainforest, is we could change that by just reducing our consumerism.
Am I right to assume that in a forest of it's how they make palm oil, right?
Yeah.
In a forest like that, a loriss couldn't live.
No.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of studies from the oil palm companies who want to show you about biodiversity that can live in an oil palm plantation. But even if it can, they want to produce nice fruits. They don't want animals coming in eating their fruits that are their profits to make their oil palm. But a loriss couldn't live in an oil palm plantation. Interestingly, they can live in some kinds of plantations. And where I'm doing my long-term study is a mixed farming community where people are just growing crops. And there are rows of trees that separate their fields, and those are the trees in which the lorisses live. Just like in an urban setting, you might see a squirrel or a fox. You can get some wildlife that can live in those settings, but it doesn't mean that it's a stable ecosystem that's going to prevent things like global warming.
Actually, this reminds me, I wanted to talk about still gum.
Okay.
I've read about this, and it's come up a lot because it seems like we've learned a lot about what a loriss should eat. And we've learned that gum is a majority of what it does eat. As an ignorant person, I'm imagining something like sap, or like maple syrup almost. They poke their tooth comb into a tree and they get some kind of sap, but I'm not sure how close I am.
Yeah, so all trees have fluids inside, and they have different types of fluid that we use the word exudate. Sometimes it's sticky and it's like a resin. Sometimes it's sap and it's very liquid. Sometimes it comes out of the branches and not the trunk, and we call it phloem. So there are different words for the liquids that come out of plants. They're not very nutritious. They are the dried versions of them are very high in fiber. They're very difficult to digest. You need very extreme dietary adaptations of your gut, etc., to be able to eat those foods. So lorisses weirdly have a gut passage time longer than a cow and longer than any other monkey. It goes up to 38 hours from when they eat for that food to leave their guts. Gum has to sort of sit in there for them to absorb all the nutrients from it. And it's an interesting food because it's available all year round. If you have the tool, like a tooth comb, to access it, you have food that no one else can have, so you fill your own type of niche. So we know all lorisses eat gum. They spend hours every night eating gum. They're a defendable resource, so they're territorial. They can use their venom, for example, to defend gum trees in their territory. And they also have cognitive maps. They know where all the gum trees are in their territory, and they go to them in a very specific set of routes. So it's a form, once you have a resource like that you can defend, that you could use every day or every other day, that also contributes to sort of a feeding intelligence, basically.
And then, sorry if this is still too simplistic, can you just, if we had like a small diagram, I bet one of these must exist, of what it actually, I'm still struggling with
what
this
it looks
image.
like.
For them, yeah. So they jut their little tooth comb into the side of a tree.
Yeah.
And then...
And they scoop out the bark. So they anchor their tooth comb into the tree. They could anchor their upper canines, well, actually, their upper teeth, their premolars, into the tree. And they then scoop out bark, and they could get the gum to actively flow. Sometimes trees already have a wound. So trees, maybe there's been a fire or insects have gone into the tree and made a wound, and there's like this nice crunchy crystallized gum on the outside. It looks like a lollipop. And they just rip off a piece. They could even hold it in their hand and crunch on it and lick it. So it's kind of like a maple syrup stick. But when you taste it, well, sometimes if you taste it, it's sweet. Normally it doesn't taste like anything. And sometimes it's so toxic, your skin will bubble and burn in third-degree burns. But they could still eat it.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Okay, yeah, I just didn't want to forget about that. Okay.
But they don't eat things like rubber, so they don't eat any tree exudates. It tends to be from a particular family, which is leguminosae, which are acacia trees. And there's a lot of animals in the world that eat that sort of gum. And we do. We have it in chewing gum, etc. So it's the gum arabic is one of the most common ingredients in boiled sweets, for example.
What are the threats to the slow loris?
There are many threats to the slow loris. The first is loss of the forest. So once we lose the forest, we lose most species. we still have national parks, and some species thrive in those national parks. It just so happens that the loriss is the type of species that prefers the edge of the forest. They don't. The food and the things they need tend to be in what we call tree fall zones or forest edges. So this has a twofold problem. They don't really occur in protected areas. And also, because they're on the edge, they're very easy to catch. Because they're in the areas where humans go, and they can often be seen at night.
Am I also correct in saying that because they're on the edge, that's where humans go, humans for a long time have overestimated how many lorisses exist?
Absolutely.
Interesting.
There's quite a few species that are edge specialists that we feel because we see them, they must be common. But they're not forest dwellers. So there's another type of monkey called a long-tailed macaque. It's considered a pest. It does very well in human cities, but it's very low densities in a forest. So people take them for biomedical trade. They want to move them out of cities. So we have a lot of pest animals that happen to like the kind of habitat we like. So we don't want them there with us.
Interesting.
Even that would still probably not be a huge problem. If lorisses just lived on the edge, they'd probably be okay. But it just so happens humans want them for all sorts of reasons. In Indochina, so from India all the way to China, they are the number one protected species of mammal we see in traditional medicines. They have over 100 uses. They are collected opportunistically, so they're not collected on a seasonal basis. It's if you see one, you take it because you could get a little bit of money off of it. It's not a huge money-making venture. It's actually something people really think they need in their medicine. This then also led to a pet trade because sometimes some places people think they're quite cute. But that's not always the case. In many countries in Asia, people think they're so scary and so ugly, they kill them on sight. They use them in black magic. They use them for rituals. So the cute aspect of the slow loris is a cultural perception. It's not a worldwide perception. But in those countries where they do think they're cute, such as Indonesia, which is the home to most slow loris species, and a lot of very educated middle-class people with a lot of money, and a lot of money to buy a slow loris is $20. So yet your average monthly salary may be $250. So what is that, 10% of your average monthly salary, something like that. So it's still an investment to spend $20 on a loris. And this national pet trade has been going on for a long time. Lorises have been seen in markets in Vietnam and in Indonesia and in China, Thailand as pets for at least 3 or 4 decades. And because they were common, people said there must be loads in the forest. So nobody cared. But now the numbers are declining. And it's not because of our word getting out that they're protected. It's because there are hardly any left in the forest. If you go to a guy in Indonesia and you say, I want to get a Javan slow loris, he actually uses the word habis, which means they are finished in the wild. We cannot get them anymore. We could get you one from Sumatra, but the Javan ones are gone. That's why that particular species is critically endangered. And the pet trade, because they're primates, they have a very long life history. They take 18 months to grow up. They take another 1.5 years to have their first baby. So they're not really reproducing until they're about 3 years old. And they may have just 10 babies their whole life, which probably in the wild lasts 10 to 15 years. So they're a slow reproducing species. They can't replace themselves like other animals that may be hunted as pets. They only have one baby at a time. Even if they have 2 in the wild, usually one survives. So it's not like other animals, like rodents, for example, which can have many, many babies multiple times per year. So all of these things contribute to their decline. The problem gets worse with the pet trade. It leads to something called a photo prop trade, where people can't necessarily have one as a pet, but tourists take them around beaches, and then people say, see how cute it is and want to take a photo with it. And very often that's a mask for a pet trade. So people will buy that photo prop because they feel sorry for it. Very often those animals aren't from the country where they are being paraded around. So that tourist buys the animal, releases it into a forest, and it contributes to a red squirrel, gray squirrel, invasive species problem. So having lorises just released left, right, and center. That animal may have been in a market with bird flu, with SARS, with all sorts of horrible diseases. They feel sorry for it. They release it into the forest with no disease check. All the wild animals get diseases. So these are all of these local problems of pet trade. Then it gets worse. What started in 2009 is one of these pets appeared on YouTube on a video that went viral, that's been seen millions and millions of times. it's impossible to remove this video from the internet, and every new person that sees it can join the group of people who want one as a pet. And so we've seen a massive rise in illegal smuggling of slow lorises, especially to a few destinations. So Eastern Europe, especially Russia, where it's legal to have them as pets. Japan, where it's legal to have them as pets. In the Middle East, it's legal. And they can falsify CITES permits. They can falsify the owning documentation. And people think that it's legal, or they buy it from a pet shop, so they think it's legal. But we know that when we look at the import records, almost all of those animals are illegal. And even if you pay in Japan $20,000 for a loris, you can get a bank loan, and you may buy a loris because it's impossible to have a car, or you can't have. You want something small that you can keep in a cage, and of course now we know lorises in the wild live in a area the size of 20 football pitches. We don't want them in a tiny cage.
I have so many questions about that, but let me begin with the first ones I wrote down. This is a stupid question, but I think it's an important one. Do they have any medicinal properties?
I don't know. We don't, there's never been a test to see if lorises actually have medicinal properties. But what's interesting is, for example, one of the uses of them is to put on leprosy or other wounds that are necrotic. It's since we know that their venom can eat flesh. Maybe it does eat flesh of a person with a really terrible wound. So maybe that would lead to the myth that they are healing. It's largely animistic. They're a very strong animal. They could fall out of a tree and they don't break a bone. You could try to pull them out of a tree and they're really strong. They really hold on very tightly. So a lot of these medicines are the belief that you take on the properties of that animal. So the number one use of slow lorises is after a woman has given birth, she drinks 3 in a rice tonic to regain strength because she wants to be strong like a loris. And we see the same exact beliefs in West Africa for potos, which are the African loris. People use them in traditional medicines for strength.
Why do you think people on the internet love looking at loris videos so much?
Oh man, we've done so many studies trying to understand what makes the perfect cute video, so we could try to make a wild one and make it just as cute. But the two things people love to see is a human with an animal, so human holding an animal. They like to see a big-eyed animal with the eyes really close together and forward in that cutest baby face. And with primates, they do make kind of human-like expressions. They look surprised, they look happy, they look funny. So lots of monkey videos are popular as well, but the loris has that extra cute. They're modeled. Their Ewoks are modeled after them. People love Ewoks, all these cute round things, and it's exotic. So maybe they've never seen. It's very cute, yeah. So they've never seen it before. So it catches their imagination. And the really weird thing is people love to see videos of animals eating things. So even cats eating stuff are more popular than a cat hanging out on a sofa. So the minute you have a loris eating something, that's like your winning viral video. And
yeah. So what I think makes this so fascinating for me, for one, I love looking at cute animal videos. This is how I know about a loris. This is what brings me here in this cafe with you. What is so, pardon my language, so fucked up about all of this is what I think, at least in for me, it's a really positive, I have good intentions. I think what's happening is I live in this urban world, divorced from nature, and humans have always lived close to animals, and we have this inherent desire to want to be with animals, and we're so misguided and we don't know where to put that energy, and we end up looking at them on the internet, and our good intentions end up going to contribute to a legal pet trade. And
the incredible thing, though, is people don't like to see them in the wild. When you just put a picture of an animal in a tree, oh, that's lovely.
Yeah.
And when it's in a cage suffering, they go, oh, I feel so sorry for it. And then someone will go, oh, I released it. Oh, that's wonderful. It's wonderful you released that animal to the wild. And I'm practically in tears going, oh my gosh, someone else released an animal to the wild. Probably is diseased. It has no teeth. It's sick. It's going to be in the wrong habitat. It's the wrong species. They've just ruined everything. And the public just sees that always as the the answer. They released it. And they don't really care if it dies after they released it. They're just happy with that word released.
Sure, yeah.
But if we released you to the wild and we took all your clothes away and we put you in the middle of the Peruvian jungle and said, fine, you came from here, have fun.
I wouldn't do very well. Yeah, exactly. You're very right that what I said isn't correct, because you are right that I don't want to see an animal in the wild, which means maybe my intentions aren't so good. I'm just really trying to understand what it is we're looking for when we look at those videos.
Anyone that goes to volunteer with animals in the wild, one of the first questions they ask is if they can touch it. So there's something really fundamental about us wanting to touch other animals. And even primates groom different species. They'll groom non-primates. They'll groom primates of other species. So I think there's something about primates where we like touching other animals. You can see play between primates and non-primates. So there's something where we've domesticated all of these wild animals. We like being close to other animals. And we also have this YOLA, you only live once attitude thing happening now, where any person should be allowed to do anything they want. And so they should be allowed to have that photo in Thailand or in Turkey. Well, that animal's there anyway, so can't they just have their picture with it? But I think we need to, as intelligent humans, make the line of what we can enjoy and what we have the right to interact with and touch and take from nature, because there could be a balance of those things. And we also need to be sensitive to how another species feels, because one of the problems with those slow loriss videos is they're feeding them food that's killing them. They're showing pictures of them in a threatening pose where the animal's terrified and people misinterpret it as being cute. And I think if they're educated and they know, then they might start to see that in other animal videos. So the loriss is a good example for that because it's so popular online.
That's a great point. Another thing I wanted to talk about was how Miss Fitzschneider brought this up. They're absolutely terrible, terrible pets. I mean, regardless of the morality, they scent mark everywhere, so any place that they live, there's just urine everywhere. A Westerner doesn't know that. Why would somebody who, even people that may grow up in Indonesia or Malaysia where there are lorisses, do they realize how terrible they are as pets?
In many of the countries where people have lorisses locally, there's no concept of animal welfare. So people don't have a problem with keeping an animal in a very small cage where all of its scent can stay. They wouldn't take it out and let it wander around. So this would be a first element to keeping a loris as a pet. When I spoke to Japanese pet owners, they talk about bathing the loriss every week. They talk about... I asked, I said, you've read things about these animals. Why don't you have any branches in the cage? Why is the cage empty? Oh, because I clean it all the time where it smells. So the animal's in terrible welfare to make it very clean. And they also put them in diapers so they don't scent mark around the house. But then their urine also has a lot of toxic properties, so it scalds their skin. This is one of the number one other wounds we see in lorisses is them losing all their skin on their bum, basically. But so you have even those really very educated, very wealthy people keeping this animal in a tiny cage where it's just miserable, and they are happy because they have a cute animal in a cage.
This is a dumb question. I don't know if it'll go anywhere, but I'm trying to investigate I'm trying to think about this from all different points of view. I have a cat. I've never had a pet before, and I love my cat. As a very ignorant person, and maybe other people might have this thought, I wonder, why is it, and I think my cat likes me, we hang out, he comes up and purrs. Why is that a positive, good thing, but having a loriss is terrible for the loriss?
There are a number of differences between domestic and exotic pets. Domestic pets, in the first place, for the word domestic implies thousands of years of breeding between animals and humans. And in many cases, in particular, cats and dogs are even argued to be self-selected. They self-domesticated themselves by living near human habitations, taking food from humans, almost becoming dependent on humans. So we have some of these very ancient domesticated animals that have a 10 to 20,000 year relationship with us. that's very different than taking an animal from the forest. That is not a domesticated animal. That is an exotic animal. It can live with you for 5 years and it's not a domesticated animal. It needs to probably be bred 10,000 years. There's a very interesting study in Russia where someone tried to domesticate foxes, and he took the softest eyes, floppy-eared foxes, and after 100 generations, he still didn't have a domestic fox. So that's the big difference.
That's very interesting what you said about them also self-selecting.
Yeah.
I'd never even thought about that, as if not only the thousands of years, but perhaps they were already, something about their nature made them more likely or more susceptible or more okay. Or
There's a wonderful book you should read. It's called Germs, Guns and Steel by Jared
Yes.
Diamond. And he talks about why Europeans became successful. And one of the things he looks at are the animals that were available to domesticate. So some animals are just better living with humans. And one of the most interesting ones were horses, because no one really ever managed to domesticate a zebra. They can't ride a zebra, but they can ride a horse. And it's just because those animals, they didn't have the right connection with humans. No matter how hard people tried, they couldn't select those right sort of subservient qualities even that you'd need. And the interesting things with dogs and cats is they can even read our expressions. There's studies that show we can communicate to each other because of this thousands of year relationship. And the other more practical aspect of dogs, cats, let's take hamsters. Hamsters are much more recently domesticated animals. Some species of hamsters have only been in human households for 10 or 20 years. They're still more or less wild. But the single difference between an animal like that and something like a loriss is the enormous amounts of corporate funding that's gone into developing foods and cages and enrichment structures and tubes and wheels and bedding, all the things. You can't get that for monkeys, you can't get that for meerkats, you can't get that for lorisses. So the pure welfare of the care of the animals is compromised, and then you have these animals fed really poor food. There's not even the veterinary knowledge available.
yes.
So those are the other reasons that that exotic pets are a challenge, no matter if it's a bird, a reptile, or a primate. But yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think that I do have this inkling that a lot of people see their pet and they don't think about things so nuanced. They just see, I like my pet. This is an animal. It should be, it's as simple as that for a lot of people.
There's a nice thing. There's a wonderful guy. He's called Mark Beckhoff, and he's a huge advocate for animal welfare and conservation of individuals of threatened species. And he always says, would you do it to your dog? And so I say, well, would you keep your dog in a tiny cage and never let it out? Would you not give your dog anything to climb on? Or actually, would you take your dog and make it live in a tree? Because they take a loriss and make it live on the floor and on the mattress where the dog is happy, but a loriss wants to be on a tree. Would you feed your dog chocolate bars and sugar all the time? Well, why do you do it to a loriss? Would you force your dog only out at night and never let it out in the sun? Well, why do you make a nocturnal animal come out in the sun? Would you leave your dog alone for hours and hours like you would with a loriss? So you sort of think, would you do it to your dog? No. Like what way people have exotic pets is very different what they do with their dog.
Really, just the final question, this is kind of open-ended, but how do you see the future for lorisses?
There's a lot of positive things happening for lorisses now, although the internet celebrity of them had a lot of negative effects. It has actually brought them to conservation attention as well. So in my own work and in my own research and my own conservation work, we've been able to use a lot of the illegal pet trade in a positive way for educating people. And it also has helped to fund wild field studies, because there never were wild field studies before because nobody funded lorisses. So at least we know things about them now. We know about them a bit in the wild. We have more and more people who want to study them. We have more people interested in them, more people interested in their conservation, more governments being shamed by their bad treatment of them who now consider them an animal worth protecting. So there's hope, but they probably have the same hope as most tropical species, depending on humans being a little bit less greedy and a little bit more sympathetic towards the planet on which we live.
Which is hard to be optimistic about, kind of.
Well, it's going to have to happen at some point.
Maybe, yeah, I don't know.
It either won't, or then everyone's doomed, and then we don't have to worry anymore. So,
yeah.
But
well, thank you so much for your time. I know this was like a crazy situation for an interview.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I am Nick Jackson, and that was my conversation with Dr. Anna Nekaris. Again, if you're interested, please take a look at the Little Fireface project. Thank you for listening. Until next time, goodbye.